Last week, Trump. This week, Putin. Xi Jinping is preparing to host the Russian president on Tuesday and Wednesday. So, what will they be talking about? And will Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping less than a week back influence Putin and Xi Jinping's conversations? Tell us what you think in the comments below. But while you do that, it's worth looking at how this relationship has evolved, particularly in the last 4 years that the war in Ukraine has been on. Remember, the war began on the 24th of February 2022 as Russia attacked Ukraine. But just 20 days before that, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing meeting Xi Jinping on the day of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. And that was the day both officially announced the following in a joint statement. That statement said, I quote, "Friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation," unquote. Now, that was 4 years ago. Where are those relationships now? Let's ask geopolitical strategist Velina Chakarova, who also founded the consultancy firm FACE. Now, Velina, you're more than a geopolitical expert. You've looked at the intersection of interests between Russia and China, even calling them the dragon bear. How would you rate their no-limits friendship 4 years since this was officially announced?
Thank you for the invitation. And let me start with a very brief definition of the dragon bear. The dragon bear is basically the modus operandi of strategic coordination in all systemically relevant domains between China and Russia. I coined in 2015, immediately following the first invasion of Ukraine. And if we take a look at the period between 2022, as you perfectly described it and highlighted it, and now 2026, we clearly see that the relationship has deepened in scope and in intensity of, let's say, different bilateral initiatives in this strategic domain. So there is a geopolitical and geoeconomic continuum. China has become the systemic lifeline for the Russian effort against Ukraine. And the no-limits friendship, which was coined in 2022, is rather a political branding than an alliance doctrine. Let me be clear, this is not a Western kind of model for strategic alliance. These two countries remain, of course, highly realpolitik-driven players, and that means that this modus operandi is based on strategically shared interests and incentives. This is what it makes it strategically consequential, rather than values-based platforms as we usually understand strategic alliances within the Western world. And in that sense, no-limits friendship, as I said, is not really the core of this relationship. The relationship, which started very much top down, is meanwhile being organically filled also bottom up by the countless bilateral formats in the field of economy, trade, commodities, technology, defense, security, and international and regional organizations.
Okay, lots to pass through over there, and I do want to come down specifically talk about Ukraine, for instance, but I'll do that in a moment, Velina. But then, and I think also it's arguable if some relationships in the Western world remain value-based or if they're indeed interest-driven. But just in terms of this relationship between China and Russia, what are the interests that they both share that drives this relationship? You talked about realpolitik. What is the realpolitik at play here?
So the most important component of this relationship is, of course, based on their, let's say, quite similar understanding of global geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts when it comes to the US global power projection. So that's first important common denominator for them. They want, of course, to create a credible counterweight to this American global supremacy. and they want to do it in all possible fields and across all sectors, as I said, all strategic sectors, because right now energy policy is security policy, industrial policy is security policy. You get the idea. And the second, of course, important common denominator is for them to create a kind of a mutual backing. These are, of course, revisionist regimes in a quite extensive let's say, scope. They want political stability at home. These are leaders who want to rule, let's say, for life in both countries. In that sense, they want to have this mutual backing when it comes to the stability of the political leadership. And final point, of course, they have regional overlapping when it comes to the so-called Eurasian heartland, when it comes to the Arctic, and when it comes to, let's say, strategic spheres of influence.
Across wide domains there. Let's just talk about the United States, because the US president was in China last week. Now Putin is headed there. I mean, how does Beijing, how does Xi Jinping balance both relationships here, the one with the Russian president and also with the US president?
First, we have to differentiate between the two relationships. This decade and probably the years after will be mostly dominated by the US-China relationship, the systemic rivalry between, let's say, two new superpowers. And if we consider this interregnum in terms of global geopolitics as a transitionary period, right now what we witnessed with the US-China summit is this realization on both sides that they need to engage with each other, despite the decoupling, despite the rivalry, despite the competition, because otherwise they will pull the whole global economy into an abyss. And what this is basically the narrative here. We are now entering a new phase, and that is a phase of so-called managed systemic confrontation. The relationship between Russia and China is a very different one, where China is, of course, the new superpower, especially when it comes to global economy and trade. And Russia, as it's being described by many experts, is the junior partner. So that gives you already a clue. It's a kind of an asymmetric relationship where Russia is no longer, let's say, a superpower, but it is a significant disruptive wild card in the relationship between United States and China. It can change the direction of the equation. We saw first efforts on behalf of the United States when it comes to, let's say, reversed Nixon-Kissinger approach that started with the launch, or if you wish, a relaunch of strategic dialogue at Alaska Summit. That is a dialogue between United States and Russia. But at the same time, of course, China will continue making all efforts to kind of keep Russia in its own orbit, to strengthen this asymmetric relationship, because within this asymmetric relationship between Moscow and Beijing, Beijing is still dependent on Russia on several perimeters that we will be talking about.
So, if this is the relationship of dependence, at least from when it comes to both countries to some extent, and there is also realpolitik at play, do you think there is an end date to this relationship potentially?
We use in the field of realpolitik a definition that is that there are no eternal friends nor eternal enemies, only and solely eternal interests. And of course, that goes back to your question, namely that the relationship between China and Russia being really unique right now. Never ever have they been so close in the history of the bilateral relations. But this does not mean that this direction, that this mega trend, because let's be clear, the Dragon Bear is one of the major geopolitical phenomena in the current global affairs. But this also has probably going to face certain challenges, one being the efforts of the United States to lure Russia away from China in the long term. Another one, of course, linked to their regional interests in Central Asia, in the so-called wider Eurasian landmass, and of course on broader topics of international politics.
That is a much longer discussion when you talk about Eurasia in particular, Velina. But let's just look at this particular visit. So Vladimir Putin expected on Tuesday and Wednesday in China, and you were talking about a close bilateral relationship, and you can see that in the fact that both leaders, Xi Jinping and Putin, have met each other more than 40 times. So what does Vladimir Putin want on this visit?
So interestingly, my counting shows almost 50 direct meetings since 2013. And if we count also meetings on sidelines of international conferences, probably it goes beyond 60, 65. So that tells you already a story, which is how this relationship started. It started very much in personal terms between Xi Jinping and Putin after Xi Jinping came to power. So these summits are important for the two leaders to coordinate their positions on key geopolitical topics. Then, of course, also to steer this top-down process across sectors, across industries, and across ministries, so that, of course, the Chinese-Russian relationship can, undergo the necessary steps towards more deepening. But at the same time, they will also, of course, use the opportunity right now at this particular summit, first and foremost, to coordinate the positions on not one, but two key wars going on, being Ukraine and Iran. Of course, the Chinese leader will brief Putin on the summit between United States and China. And next, of course, I think important topic will be the one linked to concrete sectors. One is, from Russian point, the energy sector, where Russia wants to shift towards becoming Asian supplier for oil and gas, and that includes, of course, China. There are several important energy projects in the gas field, but also in oil terms that will be discussed. But I think what it's going to be also on the agenda, and that's absolutely new for everyone, is what I have coined as a global system rupture coming out from the closure of Hormuz and the destruction of energy infrastructure in the Gulf. And that is a fourth systemic risk-driven global crisis after great financial crisis, after COVID, after the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine. Now we are witnessing similar multiplicative cascading effects across the global economy. And I think both being currently insulated from these negative effects are going to discuss how they are going to cope with them, because Russia is clearly going to be hard hit by, let's say, any global recession scenario, given the fact that the war economy and the current structural problems in the country are already hitting hard. And we are seeing actually a window of opportunity for what? For probably ceasefire this year on the portfolio of Ukraine.
Again, a lot to sort of pass through, but I'm glad you talked about the energy trade between the two nations, because just for everybody watching, it's just worth bringing out and highlighting that the fuel trade between the two nations, between China and Russia. I mean, China has been importing large amounts of oil, gas, and coal, especially since the war in Ukraine began. I mean, there's been reporting that China has purchased more than $376 billion in fossil fuel since the war began. We can bring up a graphic. This is from CREA, that's basically the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. It basically shows the amount of fossil fuels that China has been purchasing from Russia. And you see over there, oil is that thing in maroon. The large component of this fossil fuel trade has been oil, followed by gas, and then coal. But essentially, if you just look at that graphic, it's a fair bit of fossil fuels that China has been purchasing, especially since the war in Ukraine began. You were talking earlier, Velina, of this global energy rupture and how Russia and China will try and navigate that, just for everybody else, because everybody around the world has been affected by energy prices and this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. What will Russia and China be trying to discuss, and how to sort of circumvent the problems that have arisen as a result of the war in Iran, for example?
As I, as I was already explaining very shortly, this global system rupture is not only about energy commodities, it's also about fertilizers and about food commodities. We have let's say, global multiplicative cascading effect. That means that even those that are short-term insulated, such as United States, China and Russia, are going to be hard hit by the reality of this tsunami that is going to come at us in the second half of the year. And I think that here one big topic is the reopening of Hormuz. I'm quite certain that US officials have discussed this with China. I think, and I argue, that without security guarantees coming from China, Iran will not be inclined into opening, or let's say reopening of Hormuz, because it doesn't trust the United States. And we clearly know that China and Russia have been providing material aid to Iran, have been helping Iran with intelligence and with other important components for Iran to sustain the war. So in that sense, I think this is going to be a major issue, how to solve this and what is the interest here on behalf of China and Russia. We know for a fact that Iran is a big geopolitical domino piece in the Middle East when it comes to the interests of these two countries. But beyond Iran, of course, it's about the Gulf and it's about the messaging, because it's not the only strait that can be affected in the future. We have other important straits in the Indo-Pacific that deliver 80% of the oil supply. And again, going back to the oil supply, you clearly see that when it comes to asymmetric relationship, China is suddenly turning more and more dependent on stable and secure supply coming from Russia when it comes to oil and gas. And this is going to be, as I said, a big issue, but also when it comes to agricultural products.
But just on the Strait of Hormuz, for example, I mean, wouldn't China like for these supplies to resume through the Strait of Hormuz? Because even though, as has been reported quite a bit, China has large reserves of oil and it's also having this fossil fuel trade with Russia, China seems to be managing for the moment, although it is being hit by when it comes to fertilizers, for example. It would be in China's interest, it would seem, to have the Strait of Hormuz open. But for Russia, the reverse would be true, wouldn't it? Because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, is blocked the way it is, imports of Russian oil and fossil fuels seem to have increased, haven't they? So isn't there like a clash of interest there between Russia and China?
Not really, because even if we assume the best case scenario of reopening of Hormuz, we are still dealing with an unprecedented physical scarcity in the field of oil, gas, oil products, gas products, fertilizers. You get the idea. So basically going across all fields of key existential commodities. And this, of course, adds price premium on Russian commodities. As we know, Russia is one of the global suppliers for these commodities. And that means we saw it already, by the way, with the US waivers for sanctions on Russian supply, for example, oil. And now this waiver has been removed, but still Russia will be able to sell to much higher price. So in that sense, I think it's a common interest here just to have a coordinated position that backs the Iranian position. And that is the key issue here, because they don't want the United States to emerge victorious from this war, in a sense of removing another important geopolitical puzzle piece, similarly to what happened actually in January with Venezuela, where Russian and Chinese influence were also affected. But of course, you're completely right that the positions are not identical.
Okay, can I draw you in on Ukraine? Because this seems to be where initially a lot of the interests between Russia and China seem to have aligned, at least starting 4 years back. And if you look at their stance on Ukraine in light of US, let's say, reassessment of support for Ukraine under Donald Trump, what does that mean for Russia and China? Is it in their interests for the war in Ukraine to continue, or would they like this to draw down soon?
First, I would start with the overt statement coming from China, where they finally admitted that it's not in China's interest for Russia to lose the war against Ukraine. So this gives you already an idea about the incentive for the Chinese leadership to continue sustaining the Russian effort against Ukraine. That's about strategy. Of course, they will never admit it openly when it comes to military aid. They are still actually reluctant to deliver military aid to Russia. But if you take into consideration all the other examples of economic aid components, technological components for the Russian war effort, you clearly see that there is a continuum. There has been a continuum over the last 4.5 years. And of course, that's linked also to diplomatic backing and to the political backing between Russia and China, where China has never actually used any occasion to openly go against the Russian effort. So, of course, what's the key strategic goal here? It is that it's weakening the so-called West, it's weakening Europe, the European partners, which are regarded as actually transatlantic allies, and it keeps the United States and the European allies busy. It draws the attention away from the Indo-Pacific region. So this has been a continuum. It's going to stay like that. Now, if we assume that there's going to be a global crisis which will affect economy and trade, things might shift dramatically where for example, an incentive for ceasefire will significantly increase on both sides. We are clearly seeing this already on behalf of the United States. They want to withdraw from Europe and refocus on the Indo-Pacific. But I argue that there might be more pressure also coming from China on Russia to finally commit to the negotiations, to the trilateral format, and actually agree on something. And my expectation is that probably by the end of spring, maybe summertime, beginning of summertime, we might see some breakthrough in terms of diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine for at least this period, to have a kind of, even if it's not a peace, but to have, let's say, some sort of North-South Korean model of peace that would kind of stop the war and the devastating repercussions from this war. But more or less, strategic goals remain the same when it comes to the Chinese incentive to support.
A lot of peace plans, a lot of variations of peace plans have been suggested to bring that war to a close. But just in the end, Evelina, what should we be looking out for in this meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin?
My specific angle of analysis right now is mostly focused on this upcoming global crisis and how actually Russia and China will agree on navigating it and how they will coordinate positions on them. I argue that we already had the first positive signal coming from the US-China summit in terms of readiness to manage the systemic confrontation. And now my second big important signal, let's say strong signal, should be linked to the messaging coming from Russia and China when it comes to this managed confrontation, or if you wish, this kind of triangular global geopolitics that basically considers these three powers in different, of course, scope, but certainly in most geopolitical portfolios. And of course, the second important signal for me will be how they will position now on Iran. And as I said, on Russia, Ukraine, we had the first signal coming from Putin that the war is coming to an end. That is unprecedented after 4.5 years. Now let's see what will be the the coordinated messaging on this matter. And beyond, let's say, these two wars, of course, Hormuz and how actually the strait will be reopened. Will there be any kind of narrative coming from Moscow and Beijing in collective terms? Beyond that, there will be a lot of messaging linked to the bilateral portfolio, technology, agriculture, energy, oil and gas, commerce corridors. Arctic is a big issue right now to facilitate the alternative commerce corridor. And beyond that, fourth industrial revolution, AI driven AI, quantum physics. I mean, we have such
a long
immense
list. It's a long list, and it's always very expansive. You know what? We'll probably just come to you again after this meeting is over to sort of break it down for us and get your takeaways on that. But for the moment, for today, Velina, thanks so much for joining us and sharing that very expansive list of concerns and things to watch out for. Thanks so much, Velina.
Thank you for the invitation.
So that was it. Let us know what you think. Velina had a long list of things to watch out for there. What do you think? If there's any aspect of this visit you think we should look at in particular, you can write in the comments, share with us your thoughts as well. We look forward to them. It's also a good idea to perhaps subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. That way you get some alerts when we post new stuff. I'm Viresh Banerjee in Berlin. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.